Hi again then guys, and welcome to the very first episode of a brand new series here on the channel. It's not going to be a weekly series, it'll be every so often, and I don't necessarily plan to cover every track in the game, but this is a series which in particular is focused in on Gran Turismo Sport. But for those who are wondering, you can use, absolutely, the stuff that we're going to be talking about in these episodes in literally any racing game that features the track in question. So for this track, for instance, Special Stage Route X, you can use this in Gran Turismo 5, 6 and Sport. Not so much in Forza, of course, because you don't have the track. In the future, though, if we talk about the Nordschleife or about Le Mans, well, of course, there are tons of games that feature those tracks. So to some degree, you can apply all of these tips and tricks on those tracks, regardless of the game, which is why I haven't put GT Sport in the title of the video. Now, as far as this series goes, I've had a ton of requests from people who wanted to know how to efficiently win a race on Route X. People who are new to the Gran Turismo franchise, they're new to the track, they've never driven on it before, and from a beginner's overview level, it looks like pretty much the easiest track in the game. It's two huge straights, two long corners, really long track. Many people would say it's boring, but it seems like the easiest thing in the world. It's just basically a couple of drag strips with a couple of ovals, like a really extended NASCAR oval. What could be so difficult about that? And more importantly, why am I even doing a strategy guide at all? Well, the reason why I'm doing a strategy guide is the same reason why so many people try to race in NASCAR events and find that they lose. Because it's deceptive. In fact, I would argue that some of the most competitive racing you will ever see takes place on oval tracks, be it NASCAR, Indy, even here on Route X, mostly with LMP cars, Vision GTs and supercars. Because what many people don't think of, especially those who don't race on a track like this usually, is that there are very few circuits, apart from one like this, where you can literally have an entire grid of 16 cars finish the event within 2 or 3 seconds of the leader. That will never happen on Le Mans. It's just not physically possible for 16 cars to cross the line within that kind of time. It doesn't matter how good you all are, it just doesn't work like that. You can't do that on the Nordschleife. You might be able to get up to like 5 or 6 cars across the line within a second or two of each other, but even then, that's pushing it. Because on those kind of circuits, people who are really good set themselves apart immediately. You start to edge ahead of the competition after a number of corners. On Route X, you don't have that advantage. Even the fastest cars out there are only a few miles per hour quicker. So even then, you're looking at a couple of seconds per lap at best. And even then, it's often counteracted by draft, aka slipstream. And this is one of those tracks where slipstream really is your friend. Now, as far as breaking down each circuit in this series, I'm going to give you 5 overarching pointers. One is the layout of the circuit itself. Basically the essential things that you need to know, the length of the track, the style, my personal rating of how difficult the track is to master in effect. Then the vehicles, the kind of cars and vehicles that the track favours, the kind of cars that you should try and use here if you're racing there. Then the dangers, stuff that you need to know about on the track, stuff that you might need to worry about other drivers doing or not doing, not paying attention for instance. Then we've got race strategy, and finally endurance strategy, because a race and an endurance race are two very, very different things. First of all then, let's talk the brief overview. Now, my personal rating for this track is beginner to moderate. I would say that there are 3 levels that I'm going to rate these tracks on: beginner, moderate and pro. This track favours pros, but you certainly don't have to be. This, in fact, is one of those circuits where I would say it's actually arguably even more so down to the tuning of the car than it is the driver's skill. Because if you have a really well-tuned car, you actually can beat a ton of people without really needing to have that much skill. Now, that might seem like an argument against it being a good track, but the reality is that doesn't happen very often. More often than not, you can have a very, very close race against a ton of different people. So that's why I'm rating it beginner to moderate. It's easy to drive on, a little bit more technical to actually master the track than you might think. Now, as far as the size, it's 30.3 kilometers long, which is 18.8 miles, so it's a massive circuit. You've got 2 11-kilometer straights, 2 4-kilometer turns, and it's pretty simple. The track looks like a glow stick, so again, beginner to moderate is a pretty fair assessment. Now, as far as the kind of vehicles that are favoured here, it would seem obvious, something with a really good top speed. The reality is, though, that's not necessarily the case, because although top speed will get you into the lead, winning the race is a totally different ballgame. Because no matter how long, no matter how many laps, no matter how long the time you spend in an SSRX race, it's all about the last corner. Now, in an endurance race, it's about the pit stops and then the last corner. But in most circumstances, you're looking at 1 or 2 laps. That tends to be the length that most people will do. So with that in mind, the reason why I say the last corner is the most important in terms of strategy on this circuit is because going into the lead on the last few corners of any track would always seem like a good idea. That's exactly what you want to do. Lead the race, get the victory, of course. And that's the counterintuitive thing about Route X. I would actually say you don't want to be in the lead in the last corner. Now, technically, you could say that about every corner during the race, but it's really the last corner in particular where I would actually recommend not entering the corner in first place. Because if you do, everyone can slipstream you and you have no one to slipstream. So what that means in real terms is that you are slowing down and everyone else is speeding up behind you. That's not a good position to be in if you want to win the race. So sacrifice the lead, embrace being in second place or lower because you need it to win. Now, of course, if slipstream, draft, if boost is turned on weak or even turned off, then that's a totally different ballgame. That's more about the tuning of the car and the advantage in top speed. But again, most lobbies don't have that. Most lobbies do have slipstream, they do have boost, so that will apply. And of course, as with any of these strategies, you have to adapt it to the kind of lobby that you're in, the kind of people that you're up against. Now, as far as the cars that you need to use, as I was touching on just now, I would actually say that a really good type of car to use on Route X is something which combines a very good amount of 3 things. One is a good cruising speed on its own. That's important for if you get knocked out by a bad driver, because it means that even if you don't have draft, you're still at least quick enough to claw a couple of places back so that you don't finish in absolute last place. More importantly than that, though, is draft potential, and this is something that you'll hear me talk about quite a lot in my top speed tunes, because you have the top speed that the car can do on its own. Then you have a little bit of extra speed that you can get downhill, but then the most important thing is how close you are to the red line. And the red line is, in very simple terms, where the car will max out its rev limiter and you cannot go any faster, putting it really, really simply. Having draft potential is the way that I refer to basically having a nice big gap between where you sit at high speed and when you actually hit that rev line, or red line. So what that means is you can get in behind someone, get more speed, slipstream up behind them, and have enough speed to overtake them and slingshot past without bouncing off of the red line and losing speed immediately. In other words, you can hold speed a little bit longer and slingshot properly past them instead of just overtaking, getting up next to them and dropping back again. And you've probably seen that happen to other people. It's probably happened to you as well, depending on the car. Now, again, the third thing, handling. Handling is not to be discounted. Any track requires a car with good handling. Any track except, for instance, a drag strip. And even then you need something stable enough to hold a decent straight line. So any track and pretty much any form of motorsport requires some level of steering and handling and control. And on Route X, you need more of it than you might think. Now, in terms of placing the car on the track, and this also touches on the part of the strategy guide which is about the dangers of the circuit that you need to watch out for, you've got 3 sections of road on this track when it comes to the corners, because when you're on the straights, it doesn't matter where you drive. When you're positioning yourself to enter a corner, though, that's when it matters. Because as a general rule, the centre of the road is the sweet spot. And if you imagine the corners of Route X, as you can see here, having 4 distinct lanes. You've got the very bottom lane, the very top lane, and then kind of 2 lanes wide around the centre of the corner. That is the sweet spot. The vast majority of cars and the vast majority of tunes handle best when they're in that sweet spot. The top, you'll start to feel the car having a lot of understeer, which means it feels very heavy and you'll try to go out towards the wall and grind on the railings and therefore lose speed. Plus, I would not recommend being up there when there are other people around, because tons of people will just bash you straight into the wall, or they just won't control their car properly, and even I'm guilty of that sometimes. If somebody lower than you bumps into you, then you crash into someone else, and it has the ripple effect. Likewise, in the opposite way, if you try to get right down into the bottom of the corner, you have to have the right tune. And this is what a lot of my tunes are specifically designed for, especially stuff like for my GTR Nismo, for the Supra, where you'll notice very soft dampers and very stiff springs. That really helps with taking a low line through the corner, because not only can you undertake people, but you can also keep a lot more stability down in the bottom of the corner than a car that doesn't have a tune that's built for that. Because a car that's not built to do that, you will immediately notice does the exact opposite to what it does at the top of the corner. So instead of feeling really heavy, it feels very loose and will start to drift, and then you'll try to counter steer to bring it back, and you'll find yourself flicking and fishtailing in the opposite position, spinning out and losing the race. So that's pretty much it as far as the dangers go. Of course you need to be wary of other drivers, but it usually doesn't take very long to notice what kind of lobby you're in, what kind of people you're up against. I often have issues with lobbies of rooms because of being inconsistent with their rules, allowing certain people to bash others but then not allowing others to. I don't like that kind of inconsistency, so again, that's down to you to pick the room and either choose to stay there or don't. You could try to argue with the host if you want to. Good luck with that. Most of them don't really listen, but whatever. And in terms of strategy, of course, as I said, we have two things to get into. A shorter race, like 2 or 3 laps, maybe even 1, and then more the endurance side of things. Now on Route X, in fact on any track, endurance racing is totally different to a couple of laps. But it still has its own distinct strategy type. Now in a regular race, the strategy that I would recommend is try to get ahead of the fray as soon as you can. So even if you start right at the front of the grid or right at the back of the grid, try to get in behind other people, get that slipstream, and get out ahead of the pack as you enter the first corner, because you'll probably notice racing on this track that the vast majority of crashes happen in that first corner. People are driving a new car, they've pulled something new out of the garage, maybe they've tweaked the tune a bit, they don't know how to handle it yet, and they'll careen straight into you. So if you can avoid that by being even a little bit out in the lead, that's a great thing. So entering the first corner, I would always recommend trying to be first. But make sure that you're first if you can be by a little bit of a decent margin. If you cannot be in the absolute first place, I'd actually recommend dropping off the throttle a little bit, allowing other people to give you some space, and then you'll notice them all crashing in front of you. Unless of course it's a really good lobby, then just use the draft and you'll keep up with them anyway. As far as the strategy toward the end of the race, we'll of course employ what I just said throughout all of the corners to some degree, although the first one is always the worst. But ultimately the strategy to win on Route X is down to that last corner. Hang back. Like I said, don't try to enter the corner first, but also don't be at the back of the grid, because just like with the first turn, you don't want to be careening through tons of spinning, crashing cars, because chances are you'll hit one of them and it will mess it up for you too. Now all of this is a lot to take in if you are new to the track, but of course it all comes down to experience as well. I personally have driven somewhere in excess of 150,000 miles on Route X over Gran Turismo 6 and Gran Turismo Sport. So I've driven a lot on this track, and for a track that's so simple, it really is an art. There is an art to racing, and not just an art to winning, but to being a good driver on Route X. So many people just think it's about the speed, and they have no etiquette whatsoever. It really is an art, and when you get it right, it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of respect between the best drivers on this track, and you can get some of the most competitive and closest racing you will ever see on Route X. Now, as far as endurance strategy goes, well, this is where it gets slightly different, because with endurance strategy, there's one little tip that a lot of people don't do, which I would strongly recommend you do employ. And this is something which I used to do on Gran Turismo 6 in particular, but I think it will probably still work on Gran Turismo Sport as well, and that is draft. Now, I said already, try to draft or slipstream the pack as much as you can, but in a normal race, that's more about the speed. It's just keeping up. In an endurance race, it's for an entirely different purpose. In fact, I would specifically not recommend overtaking the leader. If you can stay behind the leader in an endurance race on this track, that is the best thing to do. Even if it means backing off the throttle a little bit, or even driving on like half throttle just to maintain speed behind him. Now, some people will realise what you're trying to do, and they'll try to move, or they'll slow down to try and get you in the lead. Because what you're actually doing by using this method is saving fuel. Now, as I said, I haven't tried this anywhere near as much in sport as I did in 6, but it worked really well in 6, to the point where you could literally extend your fuel range by a lap or even 2 laps, which on this track is a huge distance, just by driving behind someone else and not using full throttle. And in an endurance race, saving that much fuel is a huge difference. Because it means that even if you pit at the same time as everyone else, you don't have to fill up as much fuel. Or, concurrently, you could not pit in and carry on and pit in later. But strategy is everything. You need to assess it as you go. Now, there's no specific set way of winning an endurance race here every time. You need a combination of all the things I've said previously. You need the cornering strategy, control your car properly, use that draft behind people to save fuel when you can. Try to be behind, if possible, the cars in the last corner, unless of course you've got a great lead, then you don't need to, you can just win. And try to avoid crashes if at all possible, because even more so in an endurance race, crashing is a very bad thing to do. Because in an endurance race, chances are you won't catch them, and you'll waste fuel trying to do so. So you really want to stay with the pack. And you want to make sure that if you're going to do an endurance race, do it with a room full of people who actually want to do it. They're not just going to smash into someone and then leave. It's a professional type of racing. Regular racing, anyone can do it. Endurance racing on Route X is a very specific art, and not that many people do it. So consequently, you won't find many rooms where you'll need to employ what I'm saying, but if you do, you'll be grateful for it. Trust me, it makes a big difference. So overall, I would say that that's pretty much it for my top 5 overview points for Special Stage Route X. As I said, I do plan to do other tracks in the future. I have 2 others in particular, the Nürburgring and Le Mans, because strategies like this tend to favour longer tracks. Something like Dragon Trail or Lake Maggiore, they're not too difficult. They're tracks which you do a couple of laps and you pretty much get a feel for it. They have strategies for sure, but longer tracks require more strategy. They require more of a strategy for pitting in. They require more of a strategy for knowing dangerous parts of the track, corners that people might forget about or just cut the corner on and go straight into the side of you. That's not an issue on Route X, of course, but the corners are important. The straights are important, but the corners far more so. So for those of you who do either want to get into racing on Route X more often, or maybe you already do, I hope either way you have a ton of fun on Route X, and you can have some great racing. It single-handedly made me get PlayStation Plus again. That's how much I love this track. So overall, that's it for this strategy guide. Of course, stick around on the channel for more, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.